So how does the board ensure that the school has adequate resources to sustain the organization both short and long term? This can be done in four ways. It's done by ensuring that the school has sufficient enrollment to meet its budget, and, if not, they have policies and procedures in place to increase enrollment. The board needs to know the sources of revenue available to the school through state and federal sources, and monitor those funds to ensure that they're being received. The board needs to have policies in place for pursuing and monitoring fundraising and grant writing activities, and the board needs to remain involved legislatively in lobbying for adequate resources for charter schools. The board's responsibilities related to enrollment and recruiting are similar to how it should function in other areas. First, they need to ensure proper policies are in place, including establishing a budget with a reasonable number of projected students by grade level and a plan to meet those numbers. Next, they need to require monthly or quarterly reports on the status of enrollment. In addition, they need to hold administration accountable when enrollment is not being met, requesting that a plan be presented and implemented to increase enrollment. And lastly, the board needs to require administration to present a modified plan for approval if adjusted enrollment numbers are needed. The second way the board can ensure adequate resources is to know the sources of revenue available from both state and federal sources. On average, what percent of a charter school's budget comes from both state and federal sources? The answer is 98%. Of that 98%, what percent do you think comes from federal sources, and what percent comes from state sources? The answer is 5% from federal and 95% from state. Most people are surprised to learn that almost all of your school's funds come from the state. Of the 5% of your budget that comes from the federal government, all or most of those funds are designated to specific areas. Those include special education, title services, and food services. Note that the higher the percentage of students who qualify for free and reduced price lunches, and the higher the students on an individualized education plan or an IEP, the greater the percentage of funds coming from the federal government. Public funds, both state and federal, fall into two categories: entitlements and grants. Entitlements are those funds for which the school is entitled, simply based on the number of students enrolled at each grade level and the types of aid for which they qualify. Can you think of what types of federal and state aid might fall under the entitlement category? Examples of entitlements would include general education revenue, currently $5,302 per student based on weighted average daily membership or WADMs, title funding, special education funding, hot lunch funding, and lease aid. Grants are the other category of funds, and they generally include funds that are competitive or not guaranteed to each school. They're also not usually tied directly to the number of students. Can you think of sources of revenue in your school's budget that might fall under grants? Examples of grant funding would include quality compensation or QComp funding, federal charter school startup grants, or private grants from outside organizations such as the Walton Foundation or the Gates Foundation. It's important to note that the board should have a policy on approval of grants. This often includes a dollar amount needing approval and who has the authority to apply for grants. Grants generally carry specific requirements and ongoing monitoring by staff. Now that you're familiar with the types of federal and state revenues available to your school, you'll be completing an activity to familiarize yourself with your school's consolidated financial statement available from the Minnesota Department of Education.